ceramic students. In this video, I'm going to talk to you all about the kiln. So make sure that you get that handout from the Schoology post and that you paste it into your sketchbook. And then as I'm talking about kilns, I want you to reference the handout. And if it's already on the handout that I had you print, then you do not have to write it down. But if it is different information, then I want you to record it in your sketchbook as notes. So this is kind of like an interactive notebook for you to be able to reference as you take ceramics courses all throughout this semester. And even if you take another sculpture or ceramic class in the future, you will find this information useful. We're just going to scratch the surface here and talk about just a little bit when it comes to firing the kiln. So you have made your first several ceramics projects. So what comes next? What do you do to clay after it is completely bone dry? Hopefully you can answer this question based on the vocabulary that we have learned at the beginning of this course. After the clay is completely bone dry, which means that you have allowed all the water to evaporate out of the piece that is going to evaporate naturally, you're going to fire it in the kiln. So you're going to fire it, that's the verb. Where do you do it? The kiln. What is a kiln? A kiln is a furnace or oven for firing, baking, or drying ceramic pieces such as pottery. Let's talk about the kiln. What is a kiln? It is a furnace for firing clay. It includes two firings. We will always do a bisque firing first and then a glaze firing second. Kilns can be electric, wood, or gas powered. Another term that you need to know and write down in your sketchbook is vitrification. That was one of our vocabulary terms as well. It is also called densification. Vitrification is how clay yields to being fired at various high temperatures in the kiln. It is how the firing changes the clay's density. So basically, you need to understand that chemists have worked very hard to formulate the clay to vitrify at a certain temperature to a certain point. And then Miss Cross has done research so that she bought the right kind of clay for you and that she fires the kiln to the right temperature. So really all you have to know is that clay does go through does undergo a chemical change in the firing process, and that when your pieces come out, they have met the fusion point and they are vitrified and they are dense and they are hard and they are ready to be used like dishes, pottery, and sculpture. The two firings that you need to know are the bisque fire and the glaze fire. The bisque fire is the first firing when the clay has been fired once and it is unglazed, it has been fixed. And then what happens is the fired clay has had the chemically combined water and carbonaceous materials driven out. So what that means is natural things like carbon, but also things like bacteria or oil or brush hairs will be fired out in that bisque fire. If you add something like sawdust to your clay, that is also carbonaceous material and that will burn out in the first firing because it's going to get hot enough for that. It also dries out most of the water. So first we let the water naturally evaporate so that when the kiln reaches the boiling temperature of water, the water in your piece is not able to boil and then shatter your piece. That's why people's pieces shatter, is because they're wet usually or because there's a big air pocket in them. So that's all due to chemical reactions that are taking place at these high temperatures. But then also this further drives out the water that's at the molecular level. Then in the glaze firing, that is a cycle during which the glaze materials are heated sufficiently to melt and form a glass surface coating when cooled. And so we'll talk a little bit more about glaze and how it contains silica, alumina, flux, and metal oxides and other things. But what you need to know is that the glaze firing is usually on a hotter setting. You go to a hotter temperature, you fire it a little bit longer, and it's the second time around. So what is firing? It is a verb, and it is the heating of clay or glaze to a specific temperature in the kiln. The temperature at which the clay or glaze material melts or chemically changes is called the fusion point. So you want your stuff to get to the fusion point. That's typically my job as the Hernando High School ceramics teacher. And if you ever put the piece in the wrong firing, one of two things can happen. If you put a low fire piece in a high fire firing, which rarely, if ever, has happened, the glaze melts completely off into a pool, and it's disgusting, and it ruins a shelf. So that's bad. You've gone like well past the fusion point. But sometimes you turn in something, it's high fire, you forget to tell me that it's high fire, and I put it in a low fire kiln. It's not actually going to ruin your piece or the kiln. It's just not going to mature because it's not going to meet that fusion point. So if I ever hand you something back and say, oh, the glaze is not mature, what that term means, I want us to be on the same page, means that the kiln did not reach the temperature that it needed to for the fusion point of that glaze or clay that you had. Typically, if that ever happens, maybe there was a misfiring. Sometimes there are like electrical issues that happen at school. It is a school. And so let's say that the kiln doesn't get hot enough, then the clay and the glaze has not met the fusion point. And you say like, Miss Cross, what's the deal? I thought you put my stuff in the kiln 2 weeks ago. And I might be like, oh, last time it didn't reach the fusion point, so I'm having to fire it again. So that's what all that means. All right, let's get into the types of kilns. I don't think that this is on either handout, so definitely write these down. The first type of kiln is the wood kiln, and those are powered by wood. They are big and expensive to run, and they take several days to fire. So this is not something you will get to do in high school, but it might be something that you do in college if you major in art or ceramics. The next type of kiln is the gas powered kiln. And so this is a kiln that is powered by gas. The one on the right there on the slide looks very similar to the one that we have at school, but ours is not a gas kiln because a gas kiln is actually not very safe because you have potential explosions and you have, things can catch on fire. You could also, the gas is toxic if it's not handled the correct way. So we do not use a gas kiln in high school, but if you take ceramics in college, then typically most of your glaze firings will happen in a gas kiln. So you're going to learn how to operate one then. The next type of kiln is called a primitive kiln, and that is one that you could actually make on your own, but don't do it. Like, it's probably not safe for minors. But technically you could dig a pit in your backyard and line it with fire brick and then heat up different carbonaceous material and add wood to it for several days, and then you would have fired pieces. Typically this is something people do for decorative purposes after you've already bisqued the pieces, because there just is, so little control here. So typically you don't want to bisque your pieces. You don't want to put them through that kind of shock for the first firing, but maybe for the second firing. The next type of kiln, and if you can guess based on that image and what we see coming off that kiln, how it's powered. The next type of kiln is the electric kiln, and that is the type that we use in our classroom. And so those typically have a control box and they plug into the wall, like not a normal outlet, like an industrial strength outlet, but then they are fired and powered by electricity. They are a lot safer and easier to control. So that's why they're typically used in the school setting. That is not something that you will ever have to do as a student. You will have to help me load the kiln. You have to help me unload the kiln. I might ask you to go tell me, like, hey, go check it and tell me what temperature it says, or hey, go check it and tell me what time it says here, or hey, go read that readout. But actually starting the kiln, that is my job. All right, in a kiln, you want to create a certain atmosphere by controlling the amount of oxygen in the kiln. This affects vitrification of the clay as well as colors of glazes. This is a little past your pay grade in Ceramics 1. So basically just know that oxidation means that there's a lot of oxygen in the kiln, and reduction means that the amount of oxygen is lessened intentionally in the kiln, and that's going to affect the colors that you get. Typically reduction colors are brighter, so they're sold for more expensive prices. But that's probably not something you'll end up worrying about until you're a ceramics major. Can you tell I want all of you to major in ceramics one day, just like I did? It was great. All right, so an oxidation fire is a lot of oxygens in the kiln. Electric kilns are typically oxidation, so we don't really have a lot of control. We're not able to do reduction, and that is why usually you're going to use gas-powered kilns in colleges so that you have the ability to do reduction. It's super fun. All right, loading the kiln. This is something that you will end up helping me with. You don't just put stuff in the kiln, like one thing in there and then close it and you're done. That would be super wasteful. You actually use stilts and shelves and you pack your pieces as closely together as possible. There are several different parts. Insulating fire brick is what is on the sides of the kiln that keeps the heat inside. Elements are these little metal things, and those are actually broken and falling out of that kiln, but that metal thing is really easy to see because it is falling out, and that is the heat source inside the kiln brick. Then you have this furniture. So what you use, you typically put a layer of pottery on the bottom of the kiln, and then you put those things that are in the middle, the posts, and then you layer shelves on top of those posts. You want to have 3 posts, so you have like a tripod to kind of set the shelf on, and it will stay level and secure. And then you load more pieces on there, and you just keep doing that until the kiln is as full as possible, because the more stuff you have in the kiln, the more electrons you have bouncing around, and the less space you have for them to bounce around. So they're going to move faster, so the kiln's going to heat up faster, and that's what you want, because the faster it heats up, the more energy costs that you save, and the faster you get your pieces back. So you do want your kiln to heat up as quickly as possible. The electric, like we have an electric kiln, so the electric box is going to control it so it doesn't happen too quickly. So really as quickly as it lets it happen is good, and so you want a lot of pieces in the kiln to save money, long story short. All right, then the last picture up there, the first thing is the first thing is shelves, the middle thing is stilts or posts, and then the last picture up there is something that I call fixers. Now, I was taught by an older Tennessee gentleman from East Tennessee, so I've heard other people call the last thing stilts and then only call the middle things posts. If you ask me for a stilt, I'm gonna hand you a post. And then if you mean a fixer, I'm not going to know what you mean until you say fixer. But they're little ceramic, really hard ceramic things with like metal pieces sticking out that you can stick pieces on that need to be stilted. So yeah, I know probably are stilts, but I've always called them fixers. That's what I was taught. So that's what I say. That's what I will understand. All right. Whew. I need to take a breath. Okay, so why is the kiln firing temperature important? Kilns are fired at different temperatures, referred to as cones. And so I will say we are doing a cone, blah, 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 firing, and I'll say a number, cone this, cone that. Depending on your type of clay or glaze, your firing temperature will vary or be different. It is important to always know what type of clay and glaze you're using, and they must be compatible. Guess what? I've already chosen compatible clay and glazes for you. But you need to make sure that you know whether you used high fire glaze or low fire glaze. You never mix high fire glaze and low fire glaze on the same piece at the same time. And you need to tell me what it is when you hand it to me so that I put it with the high fire stuff if it's high fire, or I put it with the low fire stuff if it's low fire. If you put high fire glaze in a low fire kiln, it's not a huge deal. It's not going to ruin anything. Your piece is just not going to be done. It's going to be scratchy and gross, and like I'll get to it later because you didn't give it to me at the right time. If you put low fire glaze in a high fire firing, that will be disaster. So you need to make sure that you know what it is and that you tell me what it is. All right, look at this picture. That's an example of how you load or pack the kiln. Maybe some point you'll get to actually see that, but for those of you at home, that's probably not going to happen. But this is how I load the kiln, where I stack as much stuff in there as possible. I don't do this as much with ceramics one stuff because I just don't know, you know, y'all are new to clay, it might explode, like maybe you didn't make it right. So I'll spread it out a little bit more at the beginning, and then as we get better, I'll pack your pieces closest together. It's like I was saying earlier, we want to save time and money. Then actually firing the kiln, cones. We used to use pyrometric cones to control the kiln. There's a picture of them on the slideshow eventually, and they were these little really cones made out of glazed material basically, and they would melt at a certain temperature. And so you would use 3. You would use the firing cone, you would use the guide cone, and you would use the guard cone, and Manual kilns use those, and up until 2017, I think our school had a manual kiln, so we had to use cones. But now we have a fully electric kiln. So if my kiln starts acting weird, I use the cones to kind of like diagnose the problem. One of the benefits of being a ceramics major and then an art teacher afterwards, not just like art teacher in training and then all of a sudden a ceramics teacher, but the nice thing is I don't actually have to use these cones currently. So it's just kind of like an old term that has continued to be used. That is the picture of cones that I was talking about. So that first picture is what they look like. You put it in like some clay so that they'll stand up, and you call that a cone pack. And you can see like the little dots where someone has stabbed it with a needle tool. That's why I do that, because you'd always stab it with a needle tool so it would dry quickly so that you could put it in the kiln. Then that second picture is an example of what it looks like after the kiln has fired. So your first kiln, or sorry, your first cone is at lowest temperature, and you want that one to melt all the way. And actually I would always make my cone packs like longer in the front, so like it would melt into the cone pack. I don't know why they let it hang over the edge like that. And that other one's going to do the same thing, but anyways. And then your middle cone, that's the firing cone, that's the temperature you want to get to. And then you have that other cone that you don't want to melt. You just kind of want it to like barely, just a little bit, kind of start to move, and then you're like, okay, it's time to turn off the kiln. It's getting a little bit too hot. All right, that is an example of what a kiln looks like. If you open its wall, it's firing. It's like this glowing hot red looking thing. Don't do it. You'll burn off eyebrows or eyelashes. Don't ask me how I know that. I didn't open it. I just looked in the peephole without goggles and singed some stuff, and it smelled terrible. So yeah, you won't get close enough to the firing kiln when it's that hot to even do that. Don't think about it, but don't be like me. All right, so we're gonna get into kiln safety rules from there. Definitely write this down in your sketchbook. If this is not in your sketchbook, when I check the assignment, you will not get full credit. This has got to be written down because I want you to remember them. So kiln safety rule number 1, do not touch the kiln while it's firing ever. End of story. No questions, like you will hurt yourself, number 1, and then I'll be so angry with you. Number 2, never turn off or on the kiln. Ever. That's not your job. That's my job. Don't you dare. Don't touch the switches. Ever. That's not your job. That's my job. I will never ask you to touch the switches. I will only ask you to look at the readout and tell me what it says. Do not put anything in or take anything out of the kiln while it is firing. If I put something in the kiln while it is firing, it is because I have done this for a long time, and that is rare. That's like at the end of the semester when we're like really struggling and I have to like put something by an AP student like right in the top of the kiln. Like I have been known to do that, but I know exactly at what temperature I can do that. And I know at exactly what point I can do it without harming myself or anyone or anything. So don't you dare attempt that ever until you've been doing ceramics for 12 years. Do not move the kiln. It is exactly in the spot that I want it for a reason. There are certain fire codes that we have to follow. So it is on wheels. It can be moved. Don't move it. It's there for a reason. Do not ever look through the peepholes. I would not ever tell one of you to look in the peephole. If I'm looking in the peephole and you're standing behind me, you might could kind of see a little bit of the glowing red, but you're not actually going to get close enough to see inside. And if for some reason I have gone on an extended COVID leave of absence or something like that, we probably just aren't firing the kiln. But if for some reason in college you have to look in the peephole, you would always wear goggles. So these are the kiln safety rules for you and me. Basically, when the kiln is firing, stay out of that room. When the kiln is not firing, stay out of that room. When I ask you to look in the room, get in and get out. All right, so that's your kiln safety rules. I hope you have a great day.